Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Now, here is Rick Smith.
So spending a little time in the exhibit hall here at Netroots Nation in Pittsburgh. And remember, check out the work that they're doing here at netrootsnation.org, the website, if you want to follow along. One of the more interesting exhibits I came across was the Old Pros Online exhibit. Sex workers, yep, legalizing, decriminalizing. I'm not quite sure where we're going with that, but I said, maybe something would be worth a conversation. That's why I've asked Kaytlin Bailey to come talk with us. She's the founder and executive director of Old Pros Online, their website, oldprosonline.org. Seriously, check that one out. But Kaytlin, thanks for taking some time for us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I got to tell you, one of the more interesting exhibits, a lot of people, selling data processing software and how to get volunteers for this or that. Little more titillating, little more interesting, how to make sex work legal.
Sure. Well, we are absolutely interested in removing criminal penalties around sex work. We're a little bit nervous around legalization or regulation or the sort of licensing schemes. Nevada is a really good example of this. Nevada is the only state in the union with legal and regulated prostitution. It has the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution-related offenses, and it's a model that really only benefits brothel owners at the detriment of both workers and clients alike.
So what would be the ideal work conditions? Because I got to tell you,
Sure.
let's start in this place. Because I know a lot of people are going, wait a second, do we really want streetwalkers on every corner? Do we really want this kind of environment? Because we're a puritanical country, right?
Sure.
Churches on every. Do we want prostitutes out in front of the churches?
Whether we want, sex workers to be in our communities or not, we have always been integral members of communities, and we always will be, right? Sex work is older than money. So I think it's important to recognize, sex work, it's a lot like sex. You might have opinions about the kinds of sexual activities that your neighbors are engaged in, but to try to, regulate it or police it leads us to a really dark place. We've been there before. The criminalization of, the LGBTQ plus community, it doesn't go anywhere good.
Yeah, I always go back to. There's a George Carlin saying for everything.
Sure.
And the reality is, why is it illegal to sell something that's perfectly legal to give away?
Right. Yeah.
So I've always come down on that side of things, and I never understood that. So why is it that we've made it illegal? Why
I think it all comes back to, our impulse, maybe a fetish for controlling women. The way that we police prostitution in this country is we police where women go, what they wear, and who they associate with. The Dobbs decision that just came down from the Supreme Court tells us that we are really not over trying to control the reproductive bodies of women. And so, policing prostitution, I think, is really patriarchy more than it is any form of protection.
Yeah, but I got to tell you, I'm listening to you, and I'm with you, I got 2 daughters. The last thing I want is them to be in that world.
Sure.
Because I think we all have this vision of what sex work is, and maybe you can help me figure out what is and where we.
Sure.
This is.
Sex work is
because we're dirty, seedy, nasty kind of back room.
There's a lot of value judgment coming. Rick, sex work is a really broad spectrum.
Exactly, and that's why you're here to help me work through this.
But Rick, I think you can admit that there is a long list of professions, many legal, that you wouldn't want your daughters engaged in, right? Like, how would you feel about your daughters, joining the army or working at a slaughterhouse, right? I mean, there are definitely, grimy professions that take a lot out of the folks that engage with them. And I think that we can stand together, right, for workers and against exploitation, regardless of the kind of labor that folks are engaged in, right? And erotic labor is no exception. All people engage in all work on a spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion. So there are absolutely people that are called to this work, right? There are tantric sex healers. There are people that engaged in, sexual healing work. There was a fantastic documentary, The Sessions, about a sex therapist that worked with disabled folks. She had a master's degree in sex education, but she was doing sort of like skin-to-skin contact, right? Something that would absolutely be described as sex work. Then there are folks that are driven to this work because they, need to make rent, right? They need to feed their kids. They would rather be doing other things, but, because of, barriers to access or, there is a myriad of circumstances on why they wouldn't be able to engage in other work. And like other forms of labor in this country, there are people that are coerced into this work, right? Why, by an abusive boyfriend,
Yep.
right? By an abusive landlord, right? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that regardless of what brings you to this work, nobody is benefited by putting in handcuffs and being saddled with a criminal record.
No,
This
I'm right
is
there with
not
you.
a problem that we can arrest our way out of.
No, but when you think of sex work, at least when I do, and I'm not generalizing for everyone, I think exploitation.
Totally.
I think a lot of negative things that I don't want for my daughters.
That's by design. Are you familiar with the white slave myth or the white slave narrative
No,
from the 19th century? Yeah. So this comes out of the sort of the progressive era in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But it was a propaganda campaign on behalf of progressives who really sort of designed vice departments as we know it today. And they were targeting immigrant communities. They were targeting sort of recently emancipated Black communities, and they were really reacting to this idea of white middle-class women joining the workforce and engaging in, public space for the first time in the late 1870s. And so Anthony Comstock, who wrote our first obscenity laws, the Comstock laws, conflated contraception with obscenity and criminalized both, right? So it was just as illegal, right, to have sort of a titillating peep show as it was to give somebody medically accurate information about their bodies or how to prevent pregnancy. And so we created this myth that historians have widely debunked, right? There was never a moment in our nation's history where white middle-class women were being kidnapped, right, by immigrants or by Black men, right, or by Native men. That was a figment of the sort of like white middle-class imagination, and we used that sort of injected fear to create the way that we police prostitution today. Yeah, and like the sort of pimp figure that we have in sex work, this idea of like an abusive male manager, is the direct result of criminalization. Before criminalization, the overwhelming majority of sex work took place in brothels that were run and often owned by women, right? Madams were the largest landowners in the West for decades, right? But after the criminalization of prostitution, when you empower law enforcement to arrest women on the suspicion of promiscuity, right, it becomes very dangerous for women to be walking alone, eating alone, making the wrong kind of eye contact with a police officer. And so you need the pimp figure in order to procure clients, not to protect women from, abusive clients, but to protect women from the police. If you talk to sex workers, law enforcement has always been our top predator.
Now, I've heard that over and over again. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're with Kaytlin Bailey, founder and executive director of Old Pros Online. She's also the host of the Oldest Profession podcast. I'm absolutely going to check that out. I'll check out their website, oldprosonline.org. So in the perfect world, where do you see, where would you want things to go? I mean,
In the perfect world,
and how do you allay the fears of people like me who are,
Sure.
who can you see the concerns that people have about their kids getting into this kind of thing?
I think that we have a lot of anxieties around our children, engaging in any kind of sex, right? And we've done a lot of dumb things, right?
Because I think we've been beaten up as kids as well. Because
Sure.
I put sex and work together. I don't want them to go. It just doesn't seem right.
Erotic labor is like a lot of other forms of labor, and there are, it's. I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of jobs out there that are not good and not healthy for everyone, right? Like I, for example, could never work in a slaughterhouse, right? My father joined the Army at the age of 17, which I think is too young to make the decision to, kill people professionally for money. But I think that we put sex in this special category, and especially, you mentioned daughters. I don't know if you have sons or not, but I don't hear that same kind of anxiety about boys. And so, I think it's important to interrogate that idea. Is it that you don't want your daughters engaging in sex work, or is it that you don't want your daughters engaging in sex, or is it that you don't want them to be exploited and victimized
That's it.
by a society exactly that weaponizes eroticism against women? Decriminalizing sex work increases the negotiating power of people that engage in this work. Sex workers have the same goals as everyone. We want to live in safe and healthy communities. And when we call off the hunt, right, when we remove the fear of being arrested, right, when we are no longer members of a criminalized class, we can report domestic abusers. We can report violent clients. We can report violent and predatory police officers. We can take the necessary steps to protect ourselves from STIs and to keep ourselves healthy. We want to be doing all of that, but as a member of a criminalized class, we can't. So whether or not your daughters engage in sex work or not, they are the beneficiaries of living in safer and healthier communities when we free sex workers to fully participate in the communities we're already a part of.
Now, before we began the interview, you went through a pretty
Yeah.
long list of how making sex work not just legal, but
Yeah.
you know,
Decriminalized.
would be beneficial to people who don't engage in this. And I
Yes.
thought that was really an interesting argument you made.
Thank you.
Can you redo that again?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Sex workers, we want to be able to report. Abusers. Right. So sex workers, because we're a member of a criminalized class, because we're a member of a stigmatized class.
No, I got that part.
Right. We're more likely to be victimized by domestic abusers, predatory police officers, serial killers, serial rapists. When you release us from that fear, right? When our work is decriminalized, we can report those people to law enforcement. We can report those people to our communities. We can make our communities safer by being able to talk about the predators that are operating within them. But when we conflate all clients, right, with violent abusers, then we can't do that anymore. That's no longer serving us. Sex workers want to increase access to medically accurate sex education and engage in a wide variety of harm reduction work, right? We are out there advocating, right, for the monkeypox vaccine to try to protect the communities that we're already a part of from getting that terrible disease, right? The AIDS epidemic was another example of sex workers advocating not just for our own safety and health, but for the safety and health of our communities. And I will also tell you that a society that polices prostitution is policing where women go, what they wear, and who they associate with. And so your daughters living in a society that aggressively polices prostitution is actually more vulnerable, right, to being extorted by a predatory police officer, right, whether she engages in sex work or not, having her social media or harm reduction, if she's interested in talking about sexual health, right, maybe your daughter wants to post on Instagram about how upset she is about the Dobbs decision, taking away her right to decide whether or not she becomes a mother. In a society that polices prostitution, that's more likely to be shadow banned because we incentivize platforms, right, to censor all information about women's bodies. And this goes back to that very old conflation, right? Talking about the Comstock laws of conflating information about contraception with obscenity. So a society that polices prostitution is actually a society that is suppressing the freedom of movement and freedom of expression of women.
Interesting. Outside of going to oldprosonline.org to get information about the work that you do as founder and executive director of Old Pros Online, how do you plan on making this possible?
Sex workers.
What do you want people doing?
Sure. So I think you asked before, and I wasn't sure if I fully answered the question. To decriminalize sex work means to remove criminal penalties from buying, selling, and facilitating sexual services. We don't want anyone arrested, evicted, fired, or losing custody of their children just for engaging in this work. We want to change the status of sex workers in society, not only our legal status so that we are no longer criminalized, but also our social status so that we can lend our wisdom and that we can fully participate in public discourse. We have so much to add to conversations about drug use, mental health, housing insecurity, childcare. Sex workers are brilliant, really, and because of the stigmatized and criminalized nature of our work, we cannot share that wisdom with the communities that we're already in. Sex workers are self-organizing all over the country. There are a ton of bills right now that are being proposed. Legislators are starting to listen to sex workers in places like New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, Oregon, Washington, Louisiana, even D.C., our nation's capital, at a 14-hour hearing on the issue of whether or not to decriminalize sex work. Voters in Burlington, Vermont voted overwhelmingly. Over 60% of the electorate decided to remove sexist language that criminalized prostitution from their laws. So this is absolutely something that's happening. What we do at Old Pros is we try to, we produce media. We are trying to engage in culture change and try to help folks like you understand this issue and why it matters.
Yeah, the old people.
It's, folks that have never engaged in this work or don't know that they already know and probably like somebody who is engaged in this work.
Yeah, but I think most people, sex is for over here.
Sure.
And over here, and everybody else stay over there.
I mean, we live in a society, right? And so, like, in a society, people have sex with each other. That's a thing that happens.
Yeah, but we don't tell each other usually.
Sure, and sex workers aren't necessarily interested in shoving their work in your face. We just would like to be able to, we'd like to be able to use the message boards that we built and developed over years to schedule and screen our clients. We'd like to be able to engage in sex in the privacy of our own homes or hotel rooms. Like, we're having sex in places where other people are also having sex. Like, that's what we do.
There you go. No, that's a great thing. And look, while I don't know where I'm at.
Well,
I want people to be safe.
Sure.
I don't want the people to be exploited.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I come down to. I want people to.
Well, then it sounds like you support the decriminalization of sex work, and you stand with the World Health Organization, Amnesty International, the ACLU, and other human rights organizations that recognize that the only way to reduce violence and exploitation in the sex industry is by removing criminal penalties, because it is impossible to help people that you're hunting.
There you go. Oldprosonline.org, the website. There you'll find the work that Kaytlin and her organization do. Highly suggested. Also, the podcast. Make sure you check this out. Oldest Profession Podcast. Real quick, tell me about the podcast.
Yeah,
what do we find there?
Sure. The Oldest Profession Podcast, every episode we do a deep dive into a different sex worker from history. We've partnered with historian Dr. Charlene Fletcher. Every episode comes with an annotated bibliography, and we talk about, the sex workers that have always been contributing members of their communities. We talk about Lou Graham, who funded the Seattle school system. We talk about Lou Graham, who funded public schools in Seattle in the 1890s, right? We talk about the sex workers on Water Street in New Hampshire that helped, fund various charities and sort of dealt with the, folks that were down on their luck. We talk about we go way back to ancient history, but more recently we're sort of focused on the sex workers that have been erased from history that still helps shape the society and the world that we live in today.
Wow, I can just hear the right wing losing their mind as we speak, because maybe next election cycle it's not going to be CTE, it's going to be STE or something. But Kaytlin, I appreciate the time you're taking for us, the work you do. Good on you. Hope folks will take a look at the oldprosonline.org website. Kaytlin Bailey, thanks so much for taking time for us.
Thank you so much for talking.
Good stuff. Love to hear your thoughts. Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Are you all in favor of decriminalizing, in favor of legalizing? Where are you at? Email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break, right back.